let me tell you a story, and pay careful attention to what you are seeing and hearing, because not all is as it seems. A Republican, previously known as a media personality, just won the presidential election, removing the Democrats from power after only one term. He is upset. Moscow has Europe under threat. But the United States is massively outspending its transatlantic partners on defense, even after you account for GDP. His rhetoric is calling into question the durability of NATO's vaunted Article 5 clause, the treaty obligation that an attack against one is an attack against all, as he has questioned whether free riders deserve that protection if they are not holding up their end of the bargain. A story about Donald Trump? Nope, it is Ronald Reagan. Part of your hint here was the old NATO headquarters being used as the video's establishing shot. The new one is a lot shinier. And for you eagle eyes out there, note that West Germany was on the funding charts. Apologies for the poor graphics, but it is an authentic reproduction of the ancient Government Accountability Office report. Funny thing, Reagan's entry into office was not the only time that this happened. During the Cold War, at a time when one would think that Western unity would be paramount, it seemed that not a decade could pass without some threat that the United States would abandon Europe. In the 1940s, it was this exact concern that motivated European countries to sign the North Atlantic Treaty in the first place. Remember the inaugural Secretary General Lord Ismay's axiom about NATO? That it was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down? Sure, Article 5 came into existence, but did anyone really think that the United States would follow through on it? In the 1950s, it was the worry that Europe's failure to form a European defense community would lead to an American withdrawal. British newspapers proclaimed an urgent need to persuade Washington to stay, and Senate Majority Leader Robert Taft believed that stationing troops in Europe was creating a European dependency that did not serve American interests. The United States remained in NATO in name, but had Article 5 become irrelevant? Lest we forget the 1960s, when Charles de Gaulle wrote this letter to declare France's departure from NATO's unified command structure, under the belief that the United States would not adequately defend the continent from a Soviet attack, despite NATO's cool A is for Alliance headquarters in Paris. This whole affair led NATO staff to depart for a new headquarters in Brussels, and seemed to spell doom for the alliance. The United States remained in NATO in name, but had Article 5 become irrelevant? Or maybe we should consult the 1970s. That was the era of the Nixon Doctrine, the idea that allies had to be primarily responsible for their own security. This was not a message intended directly for Europeans, or future kings for that matter. Rather, the bulk of the action occurred in East Asia, with a US withdrawal from it in full effect. Still, NATO countries were left wondering if a more general retrenchment was upcoming, especially after the SALT I agreement reduced the Soviet arsenal of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles that endangered the United States, but did not touch the intermediate and tactical nukes that most threatened Europe. Never mind that there was another Senate Majority Leader upset by the spending ratios, this time named Mike Mansfield, who called for a substantial reduction of U.S. forces permanently stationed in Europe. The United States remained in NATO in name, but had Article 5 become irrelevant? You can see the pattern forming. A headline like, Europe working on plan to replace US in NATO in 5 to 10 years, could easily come from today or the early days of the organization. Or how about the evergreen headline, German politicians rebuke US president over NATO defense spending demand? What is different between then and today, though, is that now you can quickly see how the left, right, and center cover the same story, but can have very different interpretations of what is happening. And with one click, you can also discover brand new stories that the outlets you tend to focus on completely miss. Those are just some of the fantastic benefits afforded to Vantage Plan subscribers of today's returning sponsor, Ground News. And by going to ground.news/lines on maps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you too can get a 40% discount on a Vantage plan, all while supporting this channel. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Hey, even if you are doubting Article 5, you can always use Ground News to read Article number 5. Jokes aside, post-Cold War, the situation did not get much better. In the 1990s, NATO entered its wandering years without a clear set of goals, and Europe wondered if the United States would leave the alliance because its counter-Soviet purpose had been served. The United States remained in NATO in name, but had Article 5 become irrelevant? In the early 2000s, things actually looked great for Article 5. Well, maybe not great. It is supposed to deter attacks after all. But things were still good. After a brief period of mourning, NATO invoked Article 5 on October 2nd, 2001, and a coalition involving many NATO countries indeed invaded Afghanistan. However, less than 2 years later, attention turned to Iraq. NATO did not contribute to that effort, and Bush's formation of a coalition of the willing led to questions of whether ad hoc groups were the way of the future. The United States remained in NATO in name, but had Article 5 become irrelevant? And that takes us to today, a saga stretching from 2016, in which Donald Trump complains that Europe is not contributing enough to defense, bolstered by his first predecessor's establishment of spending 2% of GDP on defense as a baseline for all member states. For an alliance that is allegedly falling apart all of the time, though, it is quite remarkable that it recently celebrated its 75th anniversary. What you should take away from this is not that NATO is a dysfunctional alliance. Far from it. It is the most effective alliance ever created. Instead, all of this is more of a reflection that alliance politics are hard. If you do not accept that going into the game, you're gonna have a bad time. And look, I do not want to dismiss as irrelevant the current challenge that NATO is facing. It is not irrelevant. Remember how, back in the 1980s, it was a problem that the United States accounted for 63.7% of the alliance's defense spending? Well, in 2016, it was 72.6%. And somehow that figure is worse than it seems. There were only 15 countries in NATO when Reagan entered office. Fast forward to 2016, and there were 28. The broader point, though, is that NATO has always had problems. None of what we are seeing today is new, per se. And it is also fairly predictable. Once upon a time, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates warned Brussels of a dwindling appetite and patience in the United States to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are unwilling to devote necessary resources in their own defense. That was 2011. The upshot is that things have gotten better since then. In 2024, the U.S. share of NATO defense spending dropped to an estimated 65.6%, close to Reagan-era levels, though now 32 countries are sharing that burden. Another positive is that 23 of them are now hitting the 2% mark, even if it is outdated given recent events. And indeed, the internal battles have become more salient today, only because there is a land war in Europe again. Everyone must now have an opinion, even if they lack the historical context that this is just how the alliance works. But maybe you think Trump is serious this time. He really means it, unlike that phony Richard Nixon. And maybe you watched my prior NATO escapade, where I went to the headquarters and discussed how no one there is really worried about Washington withdrawing. However, what you are worried about is not a U.S. departure. It is that the United States will remain in NATO in name, but that Article 5 will become irrelevant. Okay, let's talk about it. We should begin by covering what exactly is in Article 5. Most who are familiar with the Alliance understand the basic principle that it declares that an attack against one is an attack against all. And you do too if you watched the beginning of this video. But that indeed is a mere principle, a pithy selling point without the full substance. It does not actually tell any of the states what that implies or how to respond. You have to go further into Article 5 to get to that payoff. Each will assist the party or parties by taking action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed forces, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Including meaning that armed force is one possibility, but not a guarantee. So what would happen in practice is that the day following an attack, 32 delegations would convene the North Atlantic Council, and they would collectively determine whether the attack meets the criteria of Article 5. That is a speed only made possible by having full delegations of every member state centralized in a single building year-round. However, invoking Article 5 can still be messy in practice. For example, on September 12, 2001, NATO indeed convened and crafted a qualified declaration of sorts, ruling that Article 5 was triggered, conditional on the discovery that the origin of the attack was foreign. It would not be until October 2nd that Article 5's invocation became official. That might be worth noting for the future, in case Russia attacks Europe, say, via some sort of covert means. But let's say that there is consensus regarding the attack. Then what happens next is everyone decides how they want to contribute. Yep, that is all. It is completely up to the individual states to decide what to do. And that is not my personal opinion on the matter. Here is NATO's own interpretation from its website. It is left to the judgment of each individual member country to determine how it will contribute. For example, think back to NATO's role in Afghanistan. A NATO force did not enter Afghanistan. A bunch of NATO countries indeed fought with the United States in Afghanistan, and there was plenty of coordination over that process through NATO. But there was no NATO banner leading the charge on the battlefield. Those that entered Afghanistan were in compliance with Article 5. Meanwhile, a country like Iceland that only sent a few people to Kabul International Airport? Well, also in compliance. Article 5 is completely flexible on this point. If you are wondering why it is like that, well, look no further than the United States. When originally negotiating the treaty, the European countries wanted Article 5 to come with a stronger commitment. However, Washington was worried that Europe would entrap the United States into fighting a war that it had no interest in. Each side looked to other recent treaties for guidance. The European template was the Treaty of Brussels, which brought Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom under a collective defense umbrella. And this one meant business. Other member states will afford the party so attacked all the military and other aid and assistance in their power. Full stop. Meanwhile, the United States looked toward the Rio Treaty of American States, which just calls for simple assistance in meeting the attack. The determining factor was that the alliance would not be much of an expansion of existing security commitments without Washington's participation. Something closer to the Rio Treaty had to be the agreed-upon language. Thus, to ensure that the words in the treaty matched the behavior that would follow, Article 5 leaves everything open to interpretation. This is an inexorable trade-off that all alliances face, on a dimension that risks full entrapment on one extreme and total abandonment on the other. Article 5 puts NATO further to the left on this spectrum than most alliances, but the precise wording pushes things back a bit. To better understand what this means for the current predicament, imagine that tomorrow Russia invaded Estonia, and then NATO convened to decide whether to invoke Article 5. You guys voted, and determined that the United States would send over an autographed copy of The Art of the Deal to assist. And by doing so, Washington has met its Article 5 responsibilities. Maybe they can even deliver it via Cybertruck. Now, some indicated that this is not a laughing matter. I agree. But that does not change the fact that an autographed book fits under Article 5's requirements. One slight note of complication here. The method by which Article 5 triggers is vague. They meet, and it is decided, and my passive voice there was intentional. Broadly speaking, NATO uses consensus decision-making, There is no voting. Instead, and again from NATO's own website, consultations take place until a decision that is acceptable to all is reached. Passive voice again. However, NATO's own interpretation of this is that sometimes member countries agree to disagree on an issue, so it is unclear. But holding up Article 5 would be a massive departure from Trump's cordial conversation with Secretary General Mark Rutte, especially given that the United States need not do much in response to the invocation. Never mind that Europe would flood U.S. arms manufacturers with orders following any such declaration, if it truly were a major attack. Now, you might be asking yourself, isn't a tepid US response the problem? Well, sure. If I were sitting in Europe and started receiving shipments of books while under attack, then yeah, I would be concerned. However, if we are thinking about the issue in practice, there are a couple of reasons we ought not jump to conclusions. For one, we do not actually know how Trump will respond. And two, for any of this to actually matter, there would have to be an attack. Let's start with the first bit. It goes without saying that Trump has a tendency to say some bombastic things, but distributing autographed copies of The Art of the Deal for Estonia is not the official policy of the United States. That does not mean that books for Europe... Wait, he's not even in NATO. Better. That does not mean that books for Europe will not happen, just that it should not be our default presumption. Indeed, interspersed with the Trump administration's complaints of European free-riding are plenty of comments to the contrary. Look no further than Pete Hegseth's trip to NATO headquarters in February, and the declaration that, quote, the United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe, full stop, end quote. Or check out the congenial meeting between Trump and Secretary General Mark Rutte in March that we just saw a moment ago. Or we can head over to the Red Sea and the private text chain about reopening freedom of navigation. Sure, there were plenty of complaints about the pathetic European free-riding, but ultimately they chose to do it because the United States is the only one that has the military capacity to do so. No one ever promised that there would be excitement over invoking Article 5, but grumpy assistance is much better than no assistance. Of course, we should always be cautious about what leaders say, though at least that last example came from a private conversation and thus has inherently greater credibility. But the reservations about public comments should cut both ways. Trump wants European partners to spend more on defense. His administration therefore compliments those that spend a lot and threatens to abandon those partners if they do not. If they believe the threat, they become more inclined to increase defense spending. But that encourages Trump to make the threat, regardless of whether he would actually speed away from an ally as fast as possible if it came under attack. Consider this. Most of the time, we think about bluffing against military opponents, where it is straightforward to understand why an incentive to misrepresent exists there. It is tempting to think that incentive disappears in relations between allies, but that is simply not the case. The upside of a bluff remains in many situations. So how might Trump respond to an attack on a NATO ally? Well, there are three things worth thinking through here. First, remember that the threat is to abandon countries that are not pulling their weight when it comes to defense spending. But think about the most likely targets of a Russian attack: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, namely those that share a notable border with Russia or White Russia. Sorry, Norway, but that northern bit does not count. For those that do matter, let's look at their estimated defense spending in 2024 as a percentage of GDP. Finland, 2.41%. Estonia, 3.43%. Latvia, 3.15%. Lithuania, 2.85%. And Poland, 4.12%. These countries rank at the top of NATO's contributors. In fact, two of them outdid the United States' 3.38%. In other words, if you take Trump's threats at face value, the countries that Russia is most likely to attack are the countries that the United States is most likely to defend. Second, we should revisit the firefighters problem that I have previously covered on this channel. This is the idea that fires have little respect for artificially drawn lines on maps. If a fire starts at your neighbor's house, it makes little sense to wait to call the fire department until it spreads to yours. And even if your neighbor refuses to pay for firefighting services, firefighters loyal to you still should extinguish the neighbor's house, because the easiest way to stop a fire is to attack it before it spreads. Similarly, if you view Europe as a row of precariously placed dominoes, then any Russian successes in the Baltics puts Central Europe in danger, which then puts Western Europe in danger, and then poof, there goes one of the United States' main export outlets. Now, it is worth noting that the same argument applies to Ukraine and risks to Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and then all of the rest. Remember, fires are not only indifferent to whether you are paying dues, but also whether you are in the club at all. This is the best argument for why the United States would be better off arming Ukraine to the hilt to fully drive Russia out of the country. Trump, obviously, is not doing that. But then again, the hawkish eastern flank of NATO also thought that the Biden administration underfunded the Ukrainian war effort. The point is that this is a conversation that would happen following a Baltic invasion, even if it might not prove persuasive to the White House. The third consideration is the United States' own security situation and the potential for a contemporaneous attack on America, or one shortly after Russia's move. Lest we forget that the United States is in an active and escalating engagement against the Houthis under Operation Prosperity Guardian. And thank you to Signal for letting everyone in America be more aware of that. Then there is the final warning to Iran about its nuclear program. Cue the thing again. And, of course, there is China, which is the entire motivation behind the Trump administration's desire to pivot to the Indo-Pacific region. If any of them were to strike American soil, Washington might want to invoke Article 5 itself. Actually, not there. Did you know that Hawaii is not covered under Article 5? Anywhere else, though, the logic applies. A damn attack against one is a damn attack against all. However, pleas for assistance would fall on deaf ears if the United States did not contribute beforehand. And remember, Article 5 just asks states to contribute as they see fit. Shipping over the art of the deal would certainly draw Europe's ire, but there is no mandate for boots on the ground. Depending on the severity of the situation, which we will get to next, simply opening up American warehouses to Europe may be enough to split the difference, where Trump avoids a transatlantic commitment without a fixed end, but Europe still receives the tools that it needs to defend itself. Lost in all of this discussion is the fact that we are presupposing a Russian attack. Indeed, for Article 5 to matter here in practice, there has to be a serious threat to Europe, which the NATO commitment either successfully deters or handles after the fact. So let's conclude with the elephant in the room, the Russian threat. To be clear, Europe could also be hit with a Houthi attack or some kind of conventional strike by Iran, but I do not think anyone is concerned about Trump's reaction on those fronts. It is not like he needs much of an excuse to hit back those opponents. No, the big concern is whatever may arise from Russia. The idea is that, in the near future, Russia wraps up the war in Ukraine and begins to set its eyes further north. You may have seen some alarmist headlines suggesting that the threat is just over the horizon, and so Europe needs to take action right now. Nevertheless, I think it is worth taking a step back for a second and comparing the war in Ukraine to what a Russian incursion into NATO territory would look like. At the beginning of 2025, Ukraine had about 880,000 soldiers fighting Russia, and over the course of 3 years, Russia has added about 11% of Ukrainian territory to its column. Let's imagine a worst-case scenario where the rest of NATO leaves the eastern flank to staff the front lines all on their own. Well, right now, including active duty and reserve personnel, Latvia has about 55,000 soldiers, Lithuania has 115,000, Estonia has 230,000, Poland has 330,000, and Finland has 900,000. Yeah, Helsinki knows what it is buying with compulsory service. A very large army indeed. Note that none of those numbers account for all of the people who will pick up whatever legacy Soviet weapons are lying around when push comes to shove, which Ukraine knows tends to be quite a few in these situations. So, how does Russia pose a real threat to those countries? Possibility number one is that Russia simply redeploys everyone from Ukraine to some target northward and prays that everything will go well, despite there being almost double the number of soldiers there compared to Ukraine, and those soldiers have the full benefits of NATO weapon integration. However, that commits the increasingly common fallacy of war and peace somehow being a dichotomous variable. Whenever the active war in Ukraine does come to an end, everyone will not simply head home and enjoy a superb bowl of borscht. No, it will be the 21st century answer to the Korean demilitarized zone, except much, much longer. To wit, the DMZ is about 248 kilometers long, while the Eastern Front in Ukraine is about 320 kilometers long, and that does not include the 280 kilometers of the Dnipro River, or the 770 kilometers of traditional international borders. Sure, Russia may be able to recall some of its forces from the region, but if it wholesale redeploys everyone to the Baltics, well, guess what? There are a lot of angry Ukrainians who would love nothing more than to take advantage of the situation and reclaim all of their lost territory. We know from the very fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, but hardly blinked an eye at Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that the Kremlin's priorities lie in what they call Little Russia. So you can cross that one out. Actually, the funny thing about the whole situation is that there is a perception in the West that what maximizes European security is to drive Russia completely out of Ukraine. That would be true if it also came with a devastating loss of materiel and personnel in the process of a retreat. But if there is an orderly retreat, because perhaps Russia views that the Ukraine situation is no longer politically tenable, that frees up way more resources to go elsewhere. After all, Russia's need to defend the internationally recognized borders is not as intense, as the Kremlin could bet against Ukraine trying to capture Russian territory, while Moscow does not hold any Ukrainian territory. As a result, the order of greatest European security goes devastating Russian loss, ceasefire along the status quo, then Russian retreat. Okay, if redeployment is not an option, how about doubling the size of the Russian armed forces? Well, that is an absolute non-starter. The Russian economy is having a hard enough time sustaining operations along a relatively manageable front in Ukraine. Moreover, doubling recruitment would not cause double the damage. If only it were that easy. All the economic burdens get exponentially worse as you try to dip further down the recruitment line. Now, I cannot tell you how long Ukraine would have to hold out in the present war for Russia to economically collapse. But I can tell you that paying market wages for soldiers to take positions along a second front would trigger an absolute economic meltdown, and corresponding marches on the streets of Moscow. We have discussed before how oligarchs have been implicitly paying for the war. The average person has been insulated economically because of rising wages. This is true even in the civilian sector, thanks to the government trying to staff both its army and its weapons factories. Well, the oligarchs would still be paying for a Baltic invasion. But the economic consequences of a second front would strain even the average Russian's quality of life, never mind pensioners on fixed incomes. That leaves forced mobilization as the third option. Well, we know how that went last time, when in September 2022, Russia reinforced its positions in eastern Ukraine. The political backlash was concerning enough that the Kremlin switched to the voluntary recruitment strategy. To give you an idea of just how little average Russians are willing to engage in these affairs, absent a competitive wage that pays a substantial risk premium, Moscow had to farm out some of its defense of Kursk Oblast to North Korea. And even if the Kremlin could somehow conjure those soldiers out of thin air, they would still need adequate supplies. The one nice thing about a ceasefire is that it will decrease the attrition rate of materiel, but Russia would still need quite a bit of metal up north. And we have not even contemplated how Europe beyond the Baltics might respond. It seems unlikely that the rest of NATO would stay silent, even if you presuppose that the United States pulls a Pepe and says, "Sorry guys, I gotta sit this one out." Worth noting here, the more that Europe invests in defense, the less likely that Russia is to make a play. You may have heard some controversy surrounding the idea that Italy alone has a stronger economy than Russia. And that is true to some degree. By nominal GDP, Italy's economy is worth $2.46 trillion. Russia's is only worth $2.20 trillion. However, as you may have rightly also heard as an objection, nominal GDP is not a good measurement if a country is trying to build weapons domestically. And it turns out that things are a lot cheaper in Russia. To properly account for that, you need GDP by purchasing power parity. There, Italy is at 3.70 trillion. Russia is at 7.13 trillion. But that should not strike fear into Europe. Add France to the mix at 4.49 trillion, and those two alone are bigger than Russia. The bottom line is that, with proper investment in defense, Europe can beat Russia without the United States, and it is not even close. After all, that was the whole point of the comments that Hegseth made during the NATO Defense Minister Summit. And speaking of Hegseth, keep in mind that this conversation completely dismissed the United States thus far. And if I may draw a parallel, remember how we once explored the possibility that Russian nuclear weapons do not work? Yeah, it is true, they may not. But how much does that ultimately matter? If there were even a 10% chance that they do, isn't that too big of a risk to get involved in a war with Russia? Well, a similar logic applies here as well. Even if there is only a 10% chance that Trump kicked open the floodgates, that is a very scary prospect for the Kremlin. For a further parallel, it might be useful to think about the American relationship with Taiwan. There is no formal alliance between the two, not since Jimmy Carter let the Mutual Defense Treaty expire. No president has formalized a commitment since then. Not Biden, and not Trump. There isn't even an official expectation of a US intervention if China were to invade the island. Rather, the United States has used a policy of strategic ambiguity to various degrees over the years, wanting to keep China out, but also not wanting to afford Taiwan the confidence to declare independence. That has served as a deterrent to Beijing, even with uncertainty over how Washington would respond. Again, because some chance of a massive response still weighs heavily on a leader's calculation. The good news for the West is that there is a silver lining here. If there had to be a time for the United States' commitment to Europe to falter, this is a pretty good one. The Kremlin is too preoccupied with Ukraine now for it to matter, and it will need at least a few years to recover once the current war is in the rearview mirror. There is also the possibility that the Kremlin will look very different by the time Russia's military power bounces back. Putin is 72 years old, and while reports of his impending demise consistently go nowhere, he is not getting younger. It is also far from a guarantee that whoever succeeds him will be economically minded and want to bury the hatchet with Europe for the purposes of raising the ruble. Indeed, the next Russian leader may very well share Putin's affinity for the era of Peter the Great, and lest we forget that the annexation of Crimea was politically popular among average Russians. But regardless of what is happening in the Kremlin, by the time that, say, 2030 rolls around, the situation in the White House may look quite a bit different. Europe is not banking on that, of course. The continent is working toward making heavy defense investments, which should start paying out around that time. And if Washington reverts back to a more traditional posture vis-a-vis Europe, the alliance will be more powerful than ever thanks to those investments. But if Washington still looks Trump-esque come 2030, Europe never followed through on all of that talk of defense spending, and Putin or a like-minded individual still leads the Kremlin, well, that will be the time to worry. Siri, set a timer for 5 years. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. You can go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to get a great discount on their Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.